Hello, Starfarers, and welcome back to the Tetra Galaxy Telecast. For today's transmission's topic, I'd like to discuss the information we have regarding Prime 4 sales numbers prior to Nintendo's next quarterly report. For those who don't know, Nintendo releases publicly viewable quarterly financial reports, and these reports detail a number of things, including, most importantly, how many units their consoles and some of their games have sold during the span being reported. The next quarterly report will release on February 3rd, and Prime 4 will certainly be on that report, so before that happens, I'd like to take a look at the information we have so far in order to get an outlook on how Prime 4 is doing sales-wise. As such, I'll be looking at all the information I can find regarding Prime 4 sales, such as sales charts and eShop rankings, and thereafter providing some analysis about the information at my disposal, speculating on how well the game is selling compared to other Metroid games, and ultimately, how many units the game may have sold in this past quarter. Keep in mind that the quarter that's going to be reported this February, the third quarter of Nintendo's fiscal year, spans from October 1st through December 31st. What this means for Prime 4 is that the first report on its global sales will cover how many units the game sold from December 4th until the end of the year, as well as pre-orders. Well, it's about time I get into the numbers, because I've got a number of, numbers to share with you guys, so with no further delays, let's begin. So, for the information I have, I'll be starting with pre-launch numbers, as this pertains to sales made outside of and before the December 4th to 31st window, so naturally, it should go first. I'm also doing this because some regions have pre-launch information available, but don't have available post-launch information, so it's good to get those regions out of the way. For pre-launch information, I'll be covering it in chronological order, starting with the earliest available information. For post-launch sales, I'll be going by region. I'll look first at Japan, then at Europe, and lastly at North America. Finally, I have a bit of information that covers both pre- and post-launch timeframes at the same time, so I'll save that stuff for the end. I should say that for the information I have, the burden of proof for whether I consider the source reliable may vary depending on what information exactly is being shared. For example, if somebody made a post saying that they saw the game at number 3 on a given country's Switch eShop, I'm willing to take them at face value, as that's something anybody could easily check at any time. However, if someone is stating the game, say, sold 15,000 copies on Amazon in a given country from December 15th to December 22nd, or something specific like that, without providing a source for that claim, I won't be taking that information as reliable. So with that said, let's take a look at those pre-orders. For pre-order information, the earliest available data is from mid-September, shortly after the September Direct, which showed Prime 4's third trailer. On September 17th, the game's sales numbers were checked on Amazon by interviewer Kiwi Talks, and at the time, it was number 2 in Australia, number 8 in Canada, number 8 in America, number 14 in Spain, number 22 in Italy, number 31 in France, and number 90 in Japan. It didn't chart at the time in the UK, Germany, or Mexico, but this seems to have been due to some system errors in the UK and Germany, where the prices were listed higher than they were supposed to be, and because pre-orders hadn't been put up just yet in Mexico at the time of the post being made, issues which were brought up by some of the replies to the Kiwi Talks post. Keep in mind that this particular post was looking at the video game category of the bestsellers list on Amazon as a whole, which includes all game materials, such as consoles, controllers, gift cards, amiibos, and more, as opposed to just games. If you look at the numbers specifically for games, so not including controllers, gift cards, and things like that, the Switch 2 edition of Prime 4 was the top-selling Switch 2 game on US Amazon as of September 18th. And furthermore, was the most pre-ordered game in the last 7 days prior to being reported as the top-selling Switch 2 game overall. It was also said that the Switch 1 version of the game was doing well too, since people preferred that game's box art. This was reported in some tweets which were covered in a video by Nintendo YouTuber Joey Ferris. The game was also number 2 for video games at that point in time in Canada, according to one commenter under the Joey Ferris video. There isn't a screenshot for this last point, but like I said, for a report just on a game's ranking in an online platform, something that anyone could easily check, I'm willing to believe what this individual stated. Jumping ahead closer to the game's release, the game was reported by Respawn to be at the top of the North American eShop as of November 30th. Some individuals who checked the eShop say that the game took the top spot earlier. I'm seeing two different people say it took the top spot on November 28th, with one of the posts saying it possibly took the spot a bit earlier. Given that, I'd say that it did take the top spot in the North American eShop on the 28th, but in the event that that proved to be untrue, then it definitely had the top spot by the 30th, as confirmed in the aforementioned article. Also worth noting that in that same article, the Switch 2 upgrade pack for Prime 4 was in 13th place, suggesting further sales for the game. That article was written on December 1st. Furthermore, I'm pretty sure that the North American eShop does encapsulate all North American countries, but just in case I'm wrong, it was first in Canada and Mexico at the same time as well, and the remaining North American countries aren't major markets, so whether the eShop is for North America or split between each country is a moot point, at least for this information. Furthermore, at this time, the game was also first in the UK, as well as Germany. Last on the docket for pre-launch information, someone on Twitter reported that the game, as of November 29th when they made the tweet, had sold over 10,000 units in pre-orders on US Amazon. However, this person didn't leave a source to support their claim, unfortunately, and given that they're purporting a specific number, something that can't easily be checked, and they lack a source, I'd have to say that I can't use this as reliable information. That's all I have for pre-launch information, so let's take a look at the post-launch numbers now. Starting in Japan, the Switch 2 edition of the game placed 6th in its first week of release on reports, as it sold 21,415 units. The Switch 1 version sold 7,586 units in its first week. In total, the game sold 29,001 units in its opening week. During its second week, the Switch 2 edition sold 3,381 units, putting the Switch 2 edition at 24,796 units sold in that span, and the reported total to 32,382 units. The Switch 1 edition sales weren't reported that week, and neither version sales were reported in subsequent weeks. This information comes from Famitsu. Keep in mind that sales reports from Japan only include physical sales, meaning that the digital units sold in Japan are not accounted for at this time, and will only appear as an unknown amount of the global sales total once that gets reported in February. Moving on to Europe, in the UK, the game was the third highest selling game overall of the week it debuted in, which was November 30th to December 6th. What this means is that Prime 4 landed in third place on 3 days of sales. It's also noted in that week's reports that the game's launch sales were around 15% lower than Metroid Dread's, a marginal difference of just a few thousand units. As of the 15th of December, the game had fallen to 15th place. For the third week since release, the game had fallen to 31st. For the week from December 21st through December 27th, it ranked 32nd, and for the week ending on January 3rd, it placed 39th. During the first week, the Switch 2 edition accounted for 83% of the game's sales, while the Switch 1 version accounted for 17%. In the subsequent weeks, the Switch 2 edition accounted for 76% of the game's sales, while the Switch 1 edition accounted for 24%. This information comes from the official weekly UK sales reports. Keep in mind that, like Japan, all of the information I've touched on here regarding UK sales is reports of physical sales only. They don't include digital sales. Also from the UK, while not an official report, someone commented under a Player Essence video discussing Prime 4's sales that the game was number 1 on the Switch 2 eShop and number 3 on the Switch 1 eShop in the UK. I captured this screenshot on January 3rd, 2026, and the comment, at that point in time, was made in the 3 weeks ago range, so somewhere between 21 and 27 days prior to my screenshotting it. Given when I got the screenshot and the age range of the comment at the time I took it, this would have been the case someday between the 7th and the 13th of December. From what we saw from the physical sales from that time frame, this seems to match up, with the Switch 2 edition doing better out of the two versions and topping the charts, while the Switch 1 edition certainly contributed, but didn't see the success that the Switch 2 edition did. In Switzerland, the Switch 2 edition of the game landed in second place overall behind FIFA 26 during the 49th week of the year, which was from the 1st to the 7th of December, which is a little different from the time frame for the UK's weekly charts, but this just seems to be that the UK charts count Saturday as the end of the week, whereas Swiss charts count Sunday as the end of the week. Anyways, that means that the game placed second overall that week in the country on 4 days of sales. After that, I can't find information on the overall ratings. However, the Swiss charts also provide top 10 lists for each console on the market. During the 51st week, Prime 4 was in 6th place for Switch 2 games. The game is also indicated by the ranking arrows to have dropped 2 spots, meaning that it was in 4th place for Switch 2 games during the 50th week. Though these indicating arrows seem to be a bit messed up, so it's possible that this wasn't the case. Given that only FIFA surpassed it in the 49th week, obviously the game was number 1 for Switch 2 games that week. Unfortunately, the Switch 1 version of the game wasn't top 10 for Switch 1 games during the 51st week, nor the 50th week based on what the arrows are indicating. I have no means of seeing if it was in the top 10 in Switch 1 games during the 49th week, though it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that to be the case. I can see, however, that it wasn't in the top 10 overall games for that week. This information is from the official weekly Swiss charts. Keep in mind that like the UK and Japan, Switzerland's charts don't include digital sales. In Spain, the game sold over 15,000 units in its debut week, which was the week from the 1st of December to the 7th of December. The Switch 2 edition placed 2nd overall that week, selling around 12,000 units, and the Switch 1 edition placed 9th overall, selling around 3,500 units. This information comes from the official Spain sales charts. Keep in mind that Spain's charts also include physical sales only, like the last few regions. In Germany, the Switch 2 edition of the game was number 1 overall for the 49th week, and the Switch 1 edition was number 7 in Switch 1 games. It doesn't show up on the charts in subsequent weeks, but only 1 or 2 games per platform do, so it's hard to judge what exactly this means for Prime 4 sales in the country. This information was provided by InstallBaseForums. They aren't the official sales chart for the country, like the ones we've looked at for previous regions, as Germany actually doesn't have one, but given their research methodologies, I do think their reports are reliable. They specify their methodologies on their site. To avoid getting sidetracked, I'll leave their words in the addendum of this broadcast, so that you can read it for yourself and judge if you think their reports are reliable or not. I do, hence their inclusion here. In France, the Switch 2 edition of the game was number 1 overall for the 49th week, which was from the 1st to the 7th of December. The Switch 1 version also charted, sitting at 9th overall. These numbers do not include bundle deals, which is noteworthy, because if you count the Switch 2 Mario Kart World bundle, Mario Kart World goes from not being in the top 10 to being 1st overall. It's worth noting as well that the report not including bundles is counted in units, whereas the one including bundle deals counts revenue. What this essentially means is, given that the Mario Kart World Switch 2 bundle is $500, Prime 4 would realistically have outsold all games that week during its 4 days of sales, but made less money than the Switch 2 bundle itself. In subsequent weeks, the game does not appear on charts, but like the reports for Germany, only 1 or 2 games per platform really do. This information was also provided by InstallBaseForum, hence the limited number of games reported each week. Also keep in mind that, as with other regions, these reports include physical sales only. Moving on to North America, I actually have one tidbit of info from Canada specifically, lucky enough. In Canada, around the same time as the comment I showed earlier on the game's performance on the UK eShop, so sometime from the 7th to the 13th of December, the game was number 1 for Switch 1 and Switch 2 games, and 2nd place overall behind NHL 26. Those Canadians really love their hockey, huh? Unlike the UK comment, this comment was not about the eShop, proven by the fact that NHL 26 isn't available for Switch 2. In all likelihood, given the nature of the reports we've looked at thus far, and the fact that this is referring to overall games, this would either mean that the game was number 2 overall in weekly reports from Canadian sales charts ending on the 6th or the 7th, or the game was 2nd overall on a major site, like the Canada Amazon page, at the time of the comment. Given that weekly sales charts for video games are not reported by Canada, and the fact that the video this comment was made under, a video by Player Essence talking about Prime 4 sales, was itself talking about the Amazon bestseller list in the US, I'm inclined to believe it's the latter of the two options. Either way, this would suggest that the game was the top Switch and Switch 2 game in Canada for at least some time. For North America as a whole, on the Switch 2 North American eShop, the Switch 2 edition of Prime 4 held the top spot until sometime on December 22nd. Since then, it has gradually slid down the chart, and was at 7th as of January 1st, 9:43 AM. The Switch 1 version of the game held the top spot on the Switch 1 North American eShop until sometime on December 12th, where it has also gradually slid down since losing the top spot, albeit at a significantly faster rate. As of the same time on January 1st, the Switch 1 version was sitting at 36 on the Switch 1 eShop. And that's what I have for post-launch information. So all I have left for you now is a little bit of information that covers pre- and post-launch sales at the same time. For one thing, while we don't have specific numbers for the digital sales in Japan, we do know that among Nintendo titles, the Switch 2 edition of the game placed 8th for the month of December, though the Switch 1 version didn't chart, meaning it didn't make the top 20. Also, the top 15 digital downloads for Nintendo games across Europe were recently reported, with downloads on the Nintendo eShop across the continent for the months of November and December both accounted for. In the month of November, the Switch 2 edition of the game placed 9th, and the Switch 1 version didn't chart, meaning it didn't make the top 15. In December, the Switch 2 edition of the game was the number 1 game, while the Switch version was the 13th ranked game. Keep in mind that the list of most downloaded games does not include purchases made on the Nintendo website, during discount periods, game voucher redemptions, free downloads, or upgrade packs. Also keep in mind that the game didn't release until December 4th. Lastly, Circana, who provide the official game charts for game sales in the US, recently released a report for the period from November 30th through January 3rd. In that time frame, Prime 4 ranked 7th overall, as well as 2nd across all Switch 1 and Switch 2 games, behind Pokemon Legends ZA, which was in 6th place. Keep in mind that Nintendo doesn't report their digital sales, whereas other companies do, so this would affect Prime 4's rankings relative to non-Nintendo games, suggesting that it would rank higher if its digital sales were included. So, with the raw data accounted for, we can now look at the picture the numbers paint. For one thing, it's apparent that the Switch 2 edition of the game accounts for the bulk of the game's sales across the board. From official sales charts, to major sites, to Nintendo's eShop across numerous countries, the Switch 2 edition is comfortably outpacing the Switch 1 edition anywhere you look. This might be surprising at first, given the Switch 1's enormous install base. However, it makes sense when thinking twice about it. For one thing, the Switch 2 is fairly new, so a disproportionate amount of the people who have the console, especially prior to the console's first Christmas, would be those that are more into video games, as well as including dedicated Nintendo fans. Metroid is the kind of series that primarily attracts these players, whereas the Switch 1 player base, while there are dedicated fans on that console, is overall much more casual, so a lot of the Switch owners may only be into the casual games like Mario Kart, Pokemon, and Animal Crossing, and didn't really care for Prime 4. Also relating to Metroid being mostly played by non-casuals, more dedicated players are more likely to care about things like getting the best possible graphics and frame rates, so it's more likely that a given person getting Prime 4 would seek the version that provides that. Also worth noting that Switch 2 editions have forwards compatibility, meaning that they can be played on the Switch 1, so it is possible that some people who are planning on getting the Switch 2 in the future went ahead and got the Switch 2 version, so as to have it for when they got the corresponding console. I doubt that a significant amount of people did this, given they can always just get the upgrade pack later, but I do think it's worth noting, as it is something that can happen. Most importantly, the Switch 2 being fairly new means that there aren't a ton of big games for the console yet. Prime 4 was really the 6th major release for the Switch 2, after Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Pokemon Legends ZA Switch 2 Edition, Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, and Kirby Air Riders. This isn't to say that the Switch 2 is struggling in terms of its library. It's not. Releasing 6 major exclusives in only 6 months is actually pretty crazy. Like, it's already got more games than the PS5. But even so, it's still true that with just how young the console is, there aren't a ton of big games on the system yet, and Prime 4 is one of those select few. So for players on a shiny new console that are looking for exciting new games to play on it, Prime 4 is going to be one of their top options, whereas on the Switch 1, while it doesn't have a ton of new releases from this year, it does have a ton of evergreen titles, like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Breath of the Wild. Of course, having said all this, it's worth reminding that it's not like the Switch 1 edition failed. it still sat at or near the top of Nintendo games for some time in just about every region. It's just that the Switch 1 edition hasn't sold as much as the Switch 2 edition, despite having the much larger install base. Although, lastly, it should be said that the Switch 2 edition has a smaller install base, yes, but it is also the hot new system that's currently the fastest selling console in history, so it's definitely got a much more active user base that are going to be looking for stuff to get for the console, which of course benefits the Switch 2 edition sales-wise. With the differences between Prime 4's two versions touched on, let's turn our attention to how Prime 4 compares to a few of its contemporaries throughout various regions. In making these comparisons, we can get a better sense of how the game is doing. In Japan, the game sold 29,001 copies in its debut week, as mentioned previously. Comparing it to Dread, these numbers are low, as Dread sold 86,000 copies in Japan its debut week, and 140,000 units in its lifetime thus far. This is to be expected. The 2D games have always been significantly more popular in Japan than the Prime games. Comparing Prime 4 sales in Japan to the previous Prime games, the game sold in the same ballpark as Hunters and Corruption, and far outsold Prime Remastered, while being a ways behind the first Prime game. Remember that these numbers for the Prime games and Dread are all in physical copies only, and as mentioned prior, games tend to sell with a roughly 50-50 digital-physical split at this time. Furthermore, Prime 4 seems to actually be doing a bit better digitally than physically in Japan, with the game being 8th in Nintendo games digitally in December, and the physical sales being well below that rank relative to other Nintendo games, except for the first week for the Switch 2 edition, when it placed 6th. Digital sales making up a prominent share of a game's sales wasn't the case back when the Wii and DS were around, and the GameCube didn't have a digital storefront at all. Given that, the physical sales numbers of Prime 4, and the aforementioned fact that Prime 4 was 8th in digital sales for Nintendo games in Japan for the month of December, I think it would be safe to say that Beyond had the best launch of any Metroid Prime game in Japan. Specifically, Prime 4 likely sold around 60,000 units in Japan in its launch week, and likely around 70,000 by the end of its second week. The highest selling Prime game in Japan to date is Hunters, with lifetime sales of 90,027 units, though again, this figure doesn't include digital sales. That shouldn't play a huge role for Hunters, being a DS game, but it's possible that the game's true lifetime sales in Japan are a bit closer to 100,000 units. Nevertheless, with all the information presented here in mind, it's likely that Prime 4 will take the title as the highest selling Prime game in Japan, given how close it is to that mark already. In Spain, Prime 4 sold over 15,500 copies in its debut week, as mentioned previously. This is more than Prime Remastered sold in its launch, at 11,000 units, but less than Dread, which sold 25,000. It is worth noting that Dread was developed in Spain, as that's where Mercury Steam is located, so that may have helped it sell in that country specifically, to some extent. In the UK, as mentioned previously, the game was noted as selling around 15% less than Dread in physical copies in its debut week. Dread had the best launch of any Metroid game in the UK, so given that Prime 4 is described as having sold only a marginally lesser total, with a difference of just a couple thousand units, it would be safe to say that Prime 4 had the second best launch of any Metroid game in the UK. In France, Prime 4 was the first Metroid game to ever hit the number 1 spot. Even Dread, the highest selling Metroid game to date, missed the top spot back when it launched in 2021. Beyond is especially successful compared to previous Prime games, where Prime 3 debuted in 5th place and Prime 2 in a dismal 19th place. In North America, for the game's place atop the North American eShop, assuming the game did get to number 1 on the eShop on the 28th, the game held the top spot from November 28th until December 22nd, holding the number 1 spot for 25 days, or 3.5 weeks. Assuming the Switch 1 version grabbed the top spot at the same time, the game held the top spot on the Switch 1 North American eShop from November 28th until December 12th, for a total of 14 days. For comparison, Prime Remastered held the top spot on the Switch 1 eShop in this region for around 3 weeks before being surpassed by Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe back in 2023. It actually reclaimed the top spot from Kirby for a few days at one point, but it lost its spot again and never reclaimed it after that. In total, the game held the top spot on the North American Switch 1 eShop for around the same amount of time that Prime 4 held the top spot on the Switch 2 North American eShop. I would know this because the source of this information is me. The key difference between the two games holding their respective top spots is that Prime Remastered faced no competition for the top spot from when it was shadow dropped on February 8th, 2023 until Kirby released on the 24th of that month, and that was it for competition it faced. Also, Prime Remastered initially only released digitally. For physical, that released in North America on February 22nd, 2023, so players could only get the game digitally for about 2 weeks, making the game even easier to sell from a digital front. Prime 4, in comparison, having launched physically and digitally at the same time, managed to hold the top spot for the amount of time it did against a Pokemon game, a Zelda game, and a Kirby game that had all released within 2 months of Prime 4's release, not to mention Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, and the fact that all of these games were in the holiday window for the first time. Clearly, Prime 4 faced much steeper competition. Granted, the Kirby and Zelda games were spin-offs, but the point still stands. It's also worth noting that Prime Remastered wasn't cross-gen, and didn't hold the top spot on 2 separate eShops, something Prime 4 did for 2 weeks. As for Dread, I did find that the game held the top spot when it launched on October 8th, 2021, and also held the top spot on November 12th of that year. If it held the top spot continuously, it would mean that the game held that spot for 35 days, and possibly more. However, it's entirely possible that the game lost that spot and reclaimed it at some point, like Prime Remastered did. In any case, the digital sales don't provide specific numbers, and while Dread may very well have held the top spot for longer, it was also only on the Switch 1, while Prime 4 was number 1 on 2 different consoles at the same time, and Prime 4 faced much steeper competition than Dread did at launch. So overall, there's no way to determine which sold better on the North American eShop. We do know that Dread sold 854,000 physical units in the month of October 2021 in the US, which landed it third on US sales charts that month. Dread placed third in its launch month, whereas Prime 4 placed 7th, but again, Dread faced much less competition, and it also didn't release during the holiday window, like Prime 4 did. Given this, I'd say that Prime 4, being the more anticipated release of the two, being cross-gen, and holding the top spot digitally on 2 fronts and 7th place physically against steeper competition than Dread faced, probably sold the same or better over its launch weeks than Dread did. Still, North American physical sales for Prime 4 aren't specified at this time, so it's impossible to tell. The overall point is that Prime 4 sales relative to Dread seem to vary by region, making it difficult to say whether Prime 4 is selling better or worse than Dread. Given that North America is Metroid's primary market, I suppose it would come down to how Prime 4 is done in that region. Given that Dread outsold Prime 4 in 2 regions, was basically the same in 1 region, and Prime 4 outsold Dread in 1 region, I'd say that the sales of the 2 games should be comparable to each other, though again, without North American numbers, there's no way to know for sure. I personally think the game is, at worst, selling a little less than Dread, and has a pretty solid chance of actually doing better, but only time will tell. On the other hand, given the information from the North American eShop, and given the numbers we've seen from Europe and Japan regarding physical sales, we can conclude with certainty that the game is selling a lot more than Prime Remastered, which is to be expected, given Prime 4 is a new, highly anticipated, cross-gen game on a 6-month-old console, whereas Prime Remastered was a shadow-dropped remaster of a 20-year-old game on the Switch 1. Also, as a bonus, I'd like to make one inter-franchise comparison, that being with Pokemon Legends ZA. Comparing the 2 games, Prime 4 sold less than Pokemon Legends ZA in physical copies in the US in the previously discussed November 30th to January 3rd timeframe. However, as discussed, Prime 4 outsold it digitally for 2 weeks on the Switch 1 and 3.5 weeks on the Switch 2 on the North American eShop. With that in mind, it would seem likely that Prime 4 sold about the same amount as Pokemon Legends ZA did in North America, or at least in the US, in that span of time. The exact numbers for ZA in that span of time aren't available either, but given just how well Pokemon games sell, and given that this was in the holiday window, it would be very significant if Prime 4 sold an equivalent magnitude to ZA for a month-long span in North America. It's also worth mentioning that Prime 4 outsold ZA digitally in Europe for the month of December on the Switch 2, which is another encouraging sign. It should be noted that there are some regions where we lack significant information on post-launch sales, like Australia, New Zealand, and Portugal, among a couple others, so we certainly don't have everything. But between North America, Europe, and Japan, we do have enough information that we should be able to deduce how the game has done sales-wise with some accuracy. Also, given that the game was number 2 for all video game products in Australia on pre-orders back in September, we could probably assume that the game is doing well in Australia. The overall outlook is that the game has done pretty well in terms of sales. Physically, the game was the top Nintendo game, if not the top game overall, during its debut week everywhere in the world except for Japan. It was one of the top games for the month of December everywhere, except, again, Japan, including being 7th in the US against games that count physical and digital sales, whereas only Prime 4's physical sales were accounted for. Speaking of digital sales, the game was at or near the top for Nintendo in every region for the month of December. It was number 1 in Europe, it was number 8 in Japan, and, while charts aren't provided, eShop rankings would indicate that it was number 1 in North America too. In all, the game topped the charts both digitally and physically nearly everywhere. Japan is the lone exception, but given the franchise sells notoriously poorly in Japan, especially the Prime games, this ultimately should prove to be of little concern. Now that I've looked at and analyzed everything, I think it's about time for me to try to answer the big question here. How many copies did Metroid Prime 4 Beyond sell in the third quarter of Nintendo's fiscal year? I will say before I answer that, because I am a huge Metroid fan, even though I'm not trying to be biased, my answer, without my realizing it, may have a positive bias towards Prime 4. I am aware that that is a thing and that can happen. However, I've looked into all the information, I've analyzed it, and while I am aware that my passion for the series might be subconsciously influencing my answer, I have to go with what my gut is telling me. So with all that said, for my answer on how many copies Prime 4 has sold through December 31st, I'm going to predict that the game has sold somewhere in the 1.8 to 2.2 million range. Being in this range in that time frame would put it well ahead of Prime Remastered, and on a pace relative to Dreads. Also, given the fact that the game was, as mentioned, a highly anticipated cross-gen release, plus other aforementioned factors, I would have to presume it's selling rather well. And of course, given how it sold relative to its very steep competition, I think it would have had to have sold something in or about that range in order to claim and hold the top spot across so many regions like it did. Having said that, I'd also like to provide what I think is the floor and ceiling for the game's sales in that window. For the floor, I could start by saying I can personally guarantee that the game has sold over 1 million units. I mean, I could have told you that the game would sell over 1 million units before it was even announced back in 2017, but yeah, there's no way it hasn't hit 1 million. Like, I'd bet my channel on it. There's no way it didn't sell 1 million. For a more specific floor, I think it's extremely likely that the game has sold at least 1.5 million units, like 95% sure. Given that, and because I'm a huge Metroid fan, I'm gonna be a little cheeky here and put the floor for the game's sales at 1.41 million, which is the same number as the number of copies that Prime 3 sold in its lifetime. As for the ceiling, I feel that I can say with some certainty that there's no chance the game sold 3 million units by December 31st. No amount of subconscious Metroid bias is gonna make me think the game sold that well in 4 weeks. For a more specific answer, I think the game could possibly have sold higher than the upper bound of my prediction range, but not by much. I'd say the ceiling is 2.5 million, and I'd be pretty surprised, and very happy, if that somehow turned out to be true. So in all, given all of the information I shared with you guys today, for the third quarter of Nintendo's fiscal year, which is from October 1st through December 31st, I think Prime 4 sold somewhere between 1.8 and 2.2 million copies, with an absolute floor of 1.41 million copies and an absolute ceiling of 2.5 million copies. So what about you? How many copies do you think Prime 4 sold in 2025? Also, is there any information that I missed that you happen to know? If you have any information or sales predictions of your own, or if there's anything else you'd like to tell me, then feel free to share it in the digital reply box down below. Station feedback is always appreciated and helps the channel to grow and improve with time. That will be all for today's broadcast. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see how I did on February 3rd, and I'll see you next broadcast.